Good evening, lovely people, fellow travellers. Welcome along to the Neil Oliver Show on GBNews TV, on radio and online. Tonight, should primary schools teach pupils about gender identity? Could national service be good for Britain's youngsters? And should we be concerned about the rise of the Asian hornets? All of that and more coming up. But first, an update on the latest news headlines. You might not have heard of the Ukrainian Azov Brigade. The fighting unit was formed of volunteers in 2014. In the beginning, it was led by Andrei Beletsky, who has said it is Ukraine's national purpose to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against Semite-led Untermensch, end quote. Untermensch means underclass, inferior people. The Azov Brigade is the product of Nazi ideology, and it's no secret. Nazi ideology that was and remains an undeniable problem for Ukraine. As recently as 2018, the United States Congress ordered that none of its aid was to be used to, quote, provide arms, training or other assistance to the Azov battalion. But last week, pictures circulated of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in what appeared to be a room in a private members' club in London, praising the brigade's members as heroes. This was, let's not forget, the same Boris Johnson who was the NATO bag carrier sent in 2022 to scupper the potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, thereby helping consign uncounted tens of thousands to the meat grinder since then. Johnson posed with the brigade's flag, told his guests and his audience, "My message to you is very simple. Thank you to the heroes from the Azov Brigade who honour us with their presence tonight." He took the opportunity to demand on behalf of Ukraine the right to fire Western-made weapons deep into Russian territory, a move that threatens the final descent into World War III, which is a hot war with Russia. In the upended, upside-down world in which we are living, it can be hard to remember what we were once invited to know as the truth. For example, I'm sure I remember at school being taught that the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and more besides, won the Second World War by defeating a bunch calling themselves Nazis. I was also definitely taught that Britain went to war with Nazi Germany with the intention of restoring freedom and democracy to those who had been denied them by the Nazis, and that by 1945 this objective had been achieved specifically by defeating those Nazis. Of course, even a cursory examination of the events that unfolded during World War II reveals it was all, to be fair, a bit more nuanced than that, to put it mildly. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the stated intention had been about restoring freedom and democracy, specifically to Poland and the Poles who had been invaded by Nazis. When I say the playing out of events was nuanced, I mean, for example, that you don't have to be much of a student of history to notice that when the war ended, Poland and the Poles were completely abandoned to be eaten alive by the Soviet. No freedom restored for them, nor democracy either. But that's international diplomacy and geopolitics for you, or to put it another way, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. All of that said, I'm still sure I remember being taught that the Allies won the Second World War and that those nasty Nazis, the enemy of all that is good, were definitely defeated by us. The Nazis, I was taught, were the baddest baddies of World War II. The very sight of their famous logo, being the swastika, was supposed to strike terror into freedom-loving hearts forever, its meaning never to be forgotten. There were other insignia besides, all beyond the pale. Never again, I'm sure I remember that slogan as well, and being urged to make all efforts to ensure nothing like Nazism and its attendant horrors could ever return to stalk the planet. Ukrainians suffered horrors in the 20th century, before, during and after World War II, that are almost unimaginable. Under Stalin, they knew the Great Ukrainian Famine, also called the Holodomor of 1932 and 1933, which killed perhaps 5 million people. Under Nazi occupation during the war, there was more suffering. More than 1 million were murdered as part of the Holocaust. Jews, gypsies, political opponents, any and all deemed undesirable. Untermenschen. At Baba Yar, a ravine near the capital city of Kiev, tens of thousands of men, women and children were ordered to strip naked before being herded into mass graves and machine-gunned to death. Some Ukrainians sided with Nazis, others sided with Russians. And then the second half of the 20th century happened, right up to and including the decades since 1989, when NATO ignored all of Russia's red lines until it was 1,000 miles closer to the bear. Then a US-enabled coup in 2014, the chasing out of Kiev of a democratically elected president disliked by Washington and favoured by Moscow. A Ukrainian civil war in which those with affiliation to Russia were the targets of sectarian violence. Estimates of 10,000 dead in the last decade in the east of Ukraine, killed by explosives dropped on them by those in the west of that country. Always the push to pull Ukraine, Russia's stated buffer against NATO, into NATO and even the European Union. And then in September last year, I watched in real life, in real time, a Ukrainian Nazi veteran of that war, of World War II, being treated to a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament, while Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau grinned and clapped along with every other parliamentarian in the room, and while President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine raised a clenched fist in salute, 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka was bathed in the adoration of all assembled. Hunka had been introduced to the throng as a Canadian war hero who had, and here's where the world turned upside down, fought the Russians during World War II. Remember, in so much as history matters, the Russians during some of the 1940s at least were our allies. Old man Hunka, as it turned out, had been a member of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, or the SS 14th Waffen Division, a Ukrainian volunteer unit under the command of those that slaughtered the tens or the hundreds of thousands at Baba Yar, those I had been taught to understand as the baddies, those Nazis. The Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Centre for Holocaust Studies said that Hunka's division, quote, was responsible for the mass murder of civilians with a level of brutality and malice that is unimaginable, close quote. So, as I said, an upside-down world, a world in which the truth is turned on its head or turned inside out or otherwise perverted. In recent years, statues have been raised in Ukraine and in Canada, as it happens, to which many Nazis fled after the war, to honour some of those Ukrainians who, during that war, served the Nazi regime. Some Ukrainian streets are named for Nazi proxies too. To this day, Ukraine, and therefore the Ukrainian army, has an undeniable Nazi problem, the Azov Brigade, now part of the Ukraine National Guard, being part of it. And so I ask myself, exactly where are we with Nazis? Did fathers and grandfathers of ours fight and die to defeat Nazis or not? While we're at it, let's not forget Operation Paperclip, when at the end of the war the United States decided there were Nazi scientists and intellectuals in Germany in possession of knowledge and skills that outweighed, as far as the US administration was concerned, any crimes they may have committed. By this means did an unknown number of Nazi scientists and thinkers enter the US, placed quietly into academia, research institutions and into every other walk of American life, so that a lifetime later a person might justifiably ask, was World War II, in which the fathers and grandfathers died, really about defeating Nazis and Nazism at all? Before Hitler and his Nazis finally became too toxic even for them, all manner of the British elite were enthusiastic supporters of his particular brand of fascism. The elite has a guiding mission after all. It's about purity of blood and preserving lineages, which just happens to have been the defining obsession of Adolf Hitler and his Aryans. A handful born to rule and billions of pesky, unwanted Untermensch cluttering up the joint, consuming resources and otherwise spoiling the view. Only the most famous or infamous is Oswald Mosley, 6th Baronet, leader of the British Union of Fascists, with a family line all the way back to the 12th century. His first wedding to Lady Cynthia Curzon in 1920 was attended by the King and Queen. His second wife was Lady Diana Mitford, daughter of another baron and dedicated fascist. Diana's sister was Unity Valkyrie Mitford, who joined the British delegation at the Nuremberg Rally in 1933 and was described by those that knew her as, quote, more Nazi than the Nazis. Lift the carpet, Listen beyond the rhetoric, and hardly a staple of the British establishment is found clean of the fingerprints of fascism. From the 16th century plantation of Ireland to the slavery and segregation of the American colonies and onwards to opposition to universal suffrage and the rest of troublesome democracy, the self-proclaimed elites have always fought to keep the lower orders, which is all of us, firmly under their boot heels. The theft of the very land itself by means of enclosure from the 13th century onwards meant that by the time of the First World War, 4/5 of the UK was in the possession of the aristocracy. Bill Gates and his greedy acquisition of more than 250,000 acres of US farmland and the World Economic Forum-driven grab for the farmland of Europe is just the latest iteration of the same old determination to rip the good stuff from the hands of the many and to centralise it in the grip of the very, very few. Millions like me were raised to believe the Allies fought the Nazis and won. The people like you and me, acted in good faith and then kept the faith. Never again we learned to cry. Never again. But I watched the footage of Johnson in London and I wondered just what really happened. Who won, who lost? What have we really learned? What are we supposed to think of the agonies of the 20th century? What were they suffered for? Here's the thing. There can be no doubt that the people of Britain, like other peoples around the West and the world, were told their forebears fought and died to defeat Nazism and Nazis. How are we, the people of this country, of the West, even to know which way is up? If an organisation in direct line of descent from Nazis is being celebrated in London within living memory of the days when Johnson's hero, Winston Churchill, railed against Nazism, just who are the good guys? And just who were the bad guys? Let's bring in Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, defence analyst, author, writer and broadcaster. Stuart Crawford, what is your assessment of that footage of Boris Johnson in those circumstances?
The Azov Brigade, as it now is, has undeniably neo-Nazi and Nazi affiliations in the past. It was, as you probably know, raised as a sort of militia in the Donetsk Oblast to resist the illegal Russian invasion back in 2014. And of course, they were unsuccessful in resisting the Russian invasion. But I think it was in 2017, the Azov Brigade was incorporated into the National Guard of Ukraine. So it became part of mainstream Ukrainian armed forces. And since then, there have been considerable efforts to distance itself from its origins. And of course, the one incident in which, or the one event in which they played a major part was the siege of Mariupol, where they retreated into the steelworks and kept the Russians out for a considerable period of time against, it has to be said, overwhelming odds before the Ukrainian government told them to surrender. So I think that we have to place it in the context of how that organization has developed. I'm not making any pleas for them. I'm not carrying a flag for them, no pun intended. But I think that the affiliations with neo-Nazism and Nazism are in the past. And certainly, of course, Boris Johnson is not a neo-Nazi, nor would he support any organisation which had such ideology.
I'll leave that there for the moment, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, but you'll be joining us later in the show, where we can get into a lengthier conversation on this topic. Thank you very much for your contribution so far, though. Joining me this evening is broadcaster, author and TV personality and chum, Ingrid Tarrant. Hello, Ingrid.
Hello, Neil.
This is an extension for me, really, of the topsy-turvy, upside-down nature of the world. Where men are really women and the countryside is racist.
Well, they don't know what they are.
And all of Britain's history and heritage is just shameful and all of the rest of it. Do you not feel that you no longer know what are supposed to be the things you can hold on to and count on?
Yeah, unfortunately, we do know, as you said, like you were taught and you were grown up to believe this and, never again and so on. But it just seems that the next generation, and we are subject to it as well, are being taught a very different story. So it's terribly confusing. And you have to stay strong, don't you, and focus to remember what really the true story is without them trying to confuse us. That's what it is, because once confused, we're easy fodder. Our minds are being taken over. And it's true, Russia was our ally in the Second World War, and that's what they agreed to do because they wanted to prevent Nazism from winning as well. And it was very clear, but it's only to do that, and then we'll go back to how we stood before. But they have broken every agreement. They have just got closer to the border, and now they're on their borders.
Why? I don't understand. Amongst the long list of things I don't understand, wasn't it, in 1989, 1990, there's 1,000 miles between NATO and Russia.
Now there's nothing.
Now, why wouldn't you want, if Russia was the big bad threat, isn't 1,000 miles of distance really worth maintaining?
Yeah, you would think.
In that context, motivated, no, let's get right up to where we can look each other into the whites of our eyes.
Yes, I know.
That's aggressive.
Yeah, that is totally aggressive and that's provocative. But also, let's not forget that they've got their nuclear plants there. That's the Western world, that's America, and it's the breadbasket of the world. So they have something to offer. If there wasn't that, and of course we've got the pipeline going through, that's another strange thing. Putin could have just turned off the tap. They didn't need to blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2 and then blame...
I know.
Oh, we're going really down a rabbit hole here, aren't we? But I get so angry about the way that this is packaged.
It's an interesting rabbit hole, but we've got a break upon us already, Ingrid, after which, should primary schools be teaching pupils about gender identity? You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. The government have recently released new guidelines restricting the teaching of relationships, sex and health education, or RSHE as it's known, in primary schools. Related to that, a new YouGov survey in the aftermath of that announcement revealed that most Britons say that schools should teach about different gender identities. The purple on that graph indicates those in favour, the red, those who are not. Basic facts of conception and birth saw 93% in favour, teaching about pornography, 72% in favour, and that people can be non-binary as a gender other than male or female, 60% in favour. OK, I'm joined now by Dr Anna Lutfi, Equality and Human Rights Barrister. Anna, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Just a quick reaction, first of all, to that finding in that YouGov poll, however much weight you put on a YouGov poll?
Well, the poll seems to suggest that a majority of Britons want these things to be taught or discussed. And of course, we live in a world where these issues are raging around us, and of course, they should be discussed. But whether they should be discussed in a way that is one-sided or partisan is another question. And I would also like to know what most Britons think gender identity is, because I don't think anyone knows.
It's such a contentious issue that inspires such passions here, there and everywhere. You've been involved in challenging this ideology and the way that this ideology is prosecuted, I suppose. Where are we at the moment, and how much does it matter that these new guidelines have been issued by the government?
Well, you touch on something that's quite complicated and difficult to distill into a short time frame, but you've hit the nail on the head when you talk about guidelines being issued and then fresh guidelines being issued, because that is indeed where we are at the moment. We were told in 2020 that schools have to teach something called gender identity. They were told they had to teach the law and the facts about gender identity as part of the RSE mandate. But of course, as I just said, gender identity is a meaningless term in law and in fact. And therefore, it is a big question mark as to what the government meant when it said, as part of LGBT content integrated through curricula everywhere in the country, schools should teach gender identity legally and factually. And this point was made quite clear in subsequent reactions to the mandated RSE guidance, which means that the government has been basically put under pressure to define gender identity. It cannot, nor can any man or woman standing. or any non-binary person for that matter. So what's happened is there's been a revision of the position of the government such that draft guidance was published in December 2023, making clear that gender identity is an ideology and that it is heavily contested as a belief system. So rather than having to teach gender identity as in terms of the law and the facts, which is impossible, the latest draft guidance, which was open for consultation and remains draft, indicates a government shift whereby they have acknowledged that gender identity is an ideological belief system. Well, if it's an ideological belief system, then other laws must surely kick in, because we do have prohibitions on the promotion of any political ideology in schools if it's not being taught as something which can be discussed and which can be challenged, and which is indeed challenged by many, many people in the country, notwithstanding the YouGov poll.
What have primary school children been being taught? What is the nature of the content? How are schools confronting this ideology?
Well, we've seen it's because of the Equality Act, which includes a protected characteristic called gender reassignment. That protected characteristic of gender reassignment is grounds on which you cannot discriminate against a person, like race, like sex, like age, disability. These protected characteristics are the cornerstones of discrimination or anti-discrimination law. And schools have been told in various documents and communications that they have to, because of the public sector equality duty in the Equality Act, they have to make their schools diverse and inclusive places where nobody suffers discrimination or bullying or harassment on the grounds of protected characteristics. Because gender reassignment is in there, that has given carte blanche to schools and other actors operating within schools to, what I would say, promote the idea of gender identity as an inclusive framework which has to be taught to children. However, gender reassignment, technically, if you look at the Equality Act, it really is about a formal process of assigning your sex from one to the other. And if we look at the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, that is clearly a legal formal process that applies to persons of 18 or over. So because the Equality Act is silent on the question of age, and it's also silent on the nature of gender reassignment as a process, that has again given carte blanche to what I would say bad faith actors to promote gender identity in schools as something that you can self-declare at any age without any negative consequences. And ultimately, that has resulted in lots of children questioning their gender and becoming disassociated from their biological sex.
As you say, there are already laws protecting and dealing with all of this, why is the government laying out guidelines? Why doesn't it just follow the law?
Well, the Equality Act 2010, which is the legislation I just mentioned, is absent on so many crucial questions when it comes to whether a child as young as 5 can be a transsexual upon self-declaring, that I would say the Equality Act 2010 on this issue is not fit for purpose. So you would imagine that would be the first priority of a government that cared about this issue. It wouldn't be in the form of draft guidance, non-statutory guidance, draft or otherwise, or statutory guidance. And what we've seen over the last few years is the issuing of various forms of guidance, gender questioning children guidance, relationships and sex education guidance, draft guidance, open for public consultation, statutory guidance, which schools are obliged to follow as far as is reasonably practicable. And as you say, these are legal questions. What needs to be clarified as a matter of law is where the Equality Act sits when it comes to persons under the age of 18 who are starting to express a dissatisfaction with their biological sex, which is a highly concerning development in any child, particularly if the child has a history of being bullied or has autism or it has mental health issues of any other kind.
Ingrid, we were talking at the top of the show about the upside down, not knowing which way is up, feeling that we're immersed in at the moment. How do you react to listening to what Anna's saying about this predicament in which primary school kids are finding themselves?
I know, but It is so confusing. As you say, the law says one thing, but it's kind of contradicted somewhere else. It's completely wishy-washy and unclear. But could then, and the 18 is kind of seems to be the key age. So could there not be an introduction of a law? Because this is really a contentious issue, and it's a lot of parents are suffering as a result of it. Their children go into school and then they come out sort of saying, I now identify as a so-and-so. They've had no part of it, but they've been groomed. I would put it down to almost grooming in school because it's so acceptable and so allowed. But could there not be a protection for children just in this particular subject? So up to the age of 18, they are not taught it. I was thinking about this. I've been thinking about this a lot and deep and hard, but particularly today as it was a topic. And I was on my way thinking, if there was a Chinese child in a class, does that mean that everybody has got to learn Chinese to be inclusive and accept that? Because to me, I know it sounds an absurd sort of example, but it kind of is as ridiculous in my mind. So.
And grooming, that's a very emotive word that Ingrid quite rightly raises there. Are children being nudged rather than informed?
I mentioned the Equality Act and I said it wasn't really fit for purpose on this issue, and I maintain that position. I think it's shared by many, many people, including many parents and teachers. But there is another piece of legislation that no one ever mentions, and it's never discussed, and I don't really know why it wouldn't have been given the spotlight when it comes to this issue. And it relates to your point about grooming. The Education Act 1996 prohibits, and that's sections 406 and 407, prohibits the promotion of political ideas, which means, putting political ideas to children which are highly contested and divisive, as if there was only one position and there's no debate and there's no contestation. That is political indoctrination. It is prohibited at law. The grooming part of this equation, which you mentioned, has many parents talk about grooming of their children, and many parents talk about indoctrination of their children in schools. The reason they do that is because there are so many actors coming into schools who are not really known entities. We don't really know much about them. We don't know their qualifications or expertise, but they've been allowed to come in carte blanche into schools to teach RSE as consultants and experts, largely because the current status quo legally is so unclear and there are so many loopholes that many schools feel completely at sea when teaching LGBT content as part of their mandate. So they ask these consultants to come in, and these consultants are using the opportunity to push and celebrate and affirm trans identity as if it had no safeguarding concerns whatsoever, and as if it wasn't a politically contested issue, which it is.
Only because of shortage of time, I'm going to have to bring that to an end at the moment. It's such an important conversation. Anna Lutfi, thank you so much. And it's a conversation that I would insist, if you're willing, that we pick up at another time.
You know where I am, Neil. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now it's a break, after which, could national service be good for Britain's youngsters? Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, last weekend, Rishi Sunak announced that he would reintroduce national service in the United Kingdom. Labour, though, said the policy was ill thought through. The proposed scheme would see youngsters required to choose between a year-long military placement or having to take part in community volunteering one weekend every month for a year. Interesting to say the least. I'm joined now by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, defence analyst, author, writer and broadcaster. Thank you for joining me this evening. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Neil.
For or against, Stuart, what do you say?
Oh, I'm hedging my bets here. I'm neither for or against, but I do see that the scheme may have some merit if we examine it in more detail. And of course, the problem is that we don't have detail because it's been very wishy-washy in its presentation. And the promise of the Royal Commission to look into how exactly it might work is one thing, but then again, the Conservative government may not be in power to set up that Royal Commission. So it's all a bit hypothetical. Having said that, I think a fundamental mistake has been made presentationally, calling it national service, because immediately a sort of unholy combination of lefty politicians and Bufton Tuftons in the leather armchairs in various London clubs are up in arms about it, because it's, compulsory military service is not popular, either with the left or the right, funnily enough. But I think if we had called it public service and saw the military side as only part of a much bigger picture, then it's worth further exploration.
My contention, though, is national service, public service, however you want to describe it, is a positive where you can be confident in the motives of the governing group. I do not have confidence in the integrity of the governing group. I point you, for example, to the notion that, were you to have a Union Jack flag flying in your garden in this country at the moment, I think you could expect a knock on the door and questions being asked by the police about hate crime. Children are taught to see the history of the country, the heritage of the country, the British Empire and the rest of it as shameful. Look at the way in which our veterans of the serving armed forces are abandoned on the streets. This is not a benevolent establishment, I would say, and I would further contend, possibly, you feel free to challenge me, that this is the on-ramp to what could eventually be conscription or a draft into the depleted services.
Well, I take all the points that you made. I think that we do live in strange times where flying a flag, whether it be the Union flag or the Saltire or any other flag, can result in a visit from PC Plod. Plus the fact that there's no doubt that the schools are feeding children with a left-orientated agenda, which is damaging, I think, in my opinion. But national conscription is something that has only been invoked in the UK in times of absolute national crisis. The First World War in 1916, when we ran out of manpower on the Western Front, for obvious reasons, and in the Second World War, when I think the whole existence of the UK was at stake. Apart from that, and apart from the sort of drawing down of it during the Cold War, if you like, between 49 and 62, it's not part of our military heritage. And it's something that the military does not really want, except in time of national crisis. And it's easy to sit and talk about it in the abstract, as I was saying to my children just the other day. But if you've got to talk about it when cruise missiles are coming in and hitting Glasgow, Birmingham, in London, then it's a completely different thing altogether.
Bear with me, Stuart. Bear with me just now. Ingrid Tarrant in the studio with me. What say you? I have deep concerns about the kind of, quite frankly, questionable establishment that we have at the moment, taking that kind of authority over our children. When there's already been rattlings about the formation of a citizen army and all sorts of renewed and escalated commitment to the land war in Ukraine. What exactly are we opening the door to here by considering this?
Are you saying really a blanket no then yourself because of, in light of the current situation?
National service, public service, that's a conversation for another day, but not when we've got an establishment and an ideology that is committed to things that are not about the nation, they're not about defence, and they are being set in the context where our children are not educated by the establishment to be proud of any nation.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a massive problem in that respect because there is no national pride. Going back to the signing up conscription, whatever you like to call it, I am very much in favour of that for very, very many reasons. But for people now to go into it, we're completely ill-equipped. And it would be cannon fodder. And, another thing is, this isn't our war. If you asked people and did a poll, nobody would want this. We would go on peace marches, actually like they're doing in Bulgaria this weekend. They're going to have millions. But it is a tricky question, but we'll go back to Stuart and then I'll talk to you about other things where I think there's goodness in it.
Stuart, would you hand on heart be confident that this kind of manoeuvring does not lead to some kind of military service to meet the needs of objectives that are not to do with the defence of this country, but to do with prosecuting what have come to be called the forever wars elsewhere?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would like to think that it wouldn't. Put it that way, because as I said previously, national conscription is only really necessary when we're looking at national survival. Having said that, and bearing in mind that the military part of what Rishi Sunak has proposed, and I'm not a Conservative supporter, as you may well know, is only a small part of a bigger picture. And I think that bigger picture is one where we need to look at what I would call resilience. And I don't mean just military resilience, but I mean resilience in terms of weather events, health events, and so on and so forth. And for the past few decades, we've existed in a sort of supermarket, just-in-time model of supply. And that recently has been found wanting across a whole spectrum of different things. And so we need to have some, if you like, redundancy in the system or some reserves in the system so that we can face future onslaughts should they come to pass.
I'll leave that there just now. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, thank you for your contribution this evening. Another such an important conversation. Ingrid, I've got another break.
Oh, already?
After which, should we be concerned about Asian hornets? Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show for the sting in the tail. Ha-ha. The Asian hornet poses a significant threat, we are told, to the UK's wildlife, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds have urged the public to report any sightings to the relevant authorities. People are being urged to report sightings of Asian hornets this summer as nature groups warn of a potential surge in damaging, invasive, non-native species. I'm joined now by social media manager at the British Beekeepers Association, Ian Campbell. Good evening, Ian Campbell. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Good evening.
Where have these insects come from? How have they got here?
They first arrived in France, southwest France, about 20 years ago. It's believed from China, and they've spread through France and a lot of countries. About 14 countries in Europe have had sightings now. And last year we started to see significant incursions into the UK.
What size of a creature are we talking about here? You know, if it was on the palm of your hand, heaven forfend.
Overall, they're a big insect. I mean, sort of getting on for twice the size of a bee or a wasp. They're about 25 millimetres long is the average size of an adult. The queens and the males later in the year are a little bit bigger. They're slightly smaller than the European hornet, which is native to this country, which we're not worried about.
What kind of wildlife do they threaten? And by extension, I suppose I'd have to say, do they pose a threat to you and me?
To an extent, there is a public health risk, yes, to humans. They can get into, I mean, in France, there's about 500,000 estimated nests around. Especially outdoor agricultural workers can be at risk. The number of serious injuries and deaths is relatively low, but they do defend their nests very vigorously. And if you get too close to a nest, you can be in trouble.
As a beekeeper, you know, you're representing the Beekeepers Association. We hear so much about the threats and the pressure that the bee population is under all the time. Does this just pile more pressure on the God-blessed bee?
It certainly does, yeah. I mean, there's about 250 species of bee in the UK. Asian hornets tend to, we're now increasingly calling them yellow-legged Asian hornets because it's a bit more descriptive and it separates them out from some other species that aren't in the UK. But this Asian hornet, it is, if it gets near a honeybee nest or a hive, it will hawk outside and it will pick off bees. They like social insects like bees and wasps. They will also take flies and spiders. But social insects live in big colonies and it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for them, and they will predate very heavily on them.
Ian, thanks so much. It's a worrisome development, I'm sure, for many people for all sorts of reasons. Thank you so much for casting a bright light of attention onto the presence among us of Asian hornets. Thank you. Thank you for watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thank you, Ingrid, for being with me so far. You can catch the second hour with extended interviews, though, over on gbnews.com now. You know it makes sense. Good evening, a continuation of a good evening, and welcome to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show, which presents myself and my guests with a chance to have longer, more relaxed, more in-depth conversation. Tonight, Operation Fishing Line. We'll speak to someone who attempted to infiltrate the World Health Organization's conference held in Killarney recently. Are we on the brink of global governance? We'll speak to Senator Ron Johnson, who has protested on this topic on Capitol Hill. Plus, we will be joined by a candidate for the presidency of Iceland. His name is Arnar Thor Johnson. All of that and more coming up. Welcome back for more of the Neil Oliver Show. Now, Irish Freedom Party candidate Michael Leahy last week embarked on what he called Operation Fishing Line, an action to infiltrate the World Health Organization's conference held at the Europe Hotel in Killarney. Joins me now. Are you there?
Good morning. Good afternoon. Lovely to meet with you. I'm a great fan of your lovely Scottish burr, which I really enjoy listening to.
Oh well, I can only say exactly the same. I'm going to very much enjoy, apart from anything else, listening to the sound of your voice. Can it, first of all, it's so fascinating. This describe for us the nature of your protest against the WHO treaty. What did you do?
Well, we only got wind of this really a few days, maybe 6 days before it happened. It's in Europe Hotel, Killarney, and Killarney is a very beautiful place. So I said, look, we need to go down and protest against this. This Tedros Ghebreyesus is an appalling man. We all know about the WHO pandemic treaty, which seems to be shelved for the moment, but only for the moment. So I said, look, we really need to go down and protest against this. We need to establish that the Irish people are not in favour of this massive loss of sovereignty and what this entails. So I took out the map and then identified where the Europe Hotel was. It wasn't a hotel I was familiar with, but it was clear it was picked because it was secure, that it wouldn't be possible for people who were not who were protesters to get in. I knew there was another protest being organised, and it was going to be at the gate of the hotel, but the people who were involved would be shelved and protected for that by a very heavy police presence. So I conceived Operation Fishing Line because, as you know, the lakes of Killarney are wonderful fishing lakes, wonderful trout lakes, and many people enjoy going out boating on them. So I'm not a very experienced fisherman. I have fished a little bit myself, but we went undercover, Neil. We took off the suit and the shirt and tie, and we put on the fishing gear, and we got our fishing rods. A few of us drove down to Killarney in the morning. We hired a fishing boat. They didn't let us take our own fishing boat, oddly enough. It's a national park, so we had to hire a local fishing boat. The individual knew nothing about what we were doing, of course. So off we went with our fishing lines out, and as we decided this was the only way to get close to this. So we went right up to the hotel, and the police came out looking at us, but we were there with our fishing lines, behaving herself perfectly well, and they disappeared. So we got as close as we could, and I took out my bullhorn and made it very clear to Mr. Gerbesius that neither he or his treaty were welcome in Ireland. And we were worried in case they mightn't hear us, but as soon as we started this, a lot of activity was visible in the hotel. The security guys came out. We saw the glint of a telescopic, either a telescope or a telescopic sight in the bushes. And as luck would have it, one of the attendees at the hotel, who happens to be the CEO of a polling company in Ireland, took a film of us from the hotel, and it was clear that our protest could be perfectly clearly heard. And this rather foolish gentleman put it up online, mocking our protest. But of course, it gave us the best clip of the video that I put out last week was the view from the hotel, because it was clear we could be perfectly clearly heard in what we said, that the Irish people did not want this treaty and did not welcome this treaty. So I think Operation Fishing Line was a wonderful success. I think that those who were present were made perfectly aware that the Irish people have no support for this treaty.
I love it. I love it. Clearly there's a light-hearted tone to what you're saying. However, deadly serious, deadly serious at the heart.
But as I was on the Steve Bannon show yesterday, and I did a musical video, which was a bit of a light-hearted affair as well. I'll send it to you. It's a Frank Sinatra song called Far Right. That's right. I changed the words to Far Right, and it was outlining. I'll send that to you. You might play it.
Maybe.
But look, it's in dark times, Neil. You need to keep a sense of proportion, and you need to have an occasional laugh, or else you go crazy. The things that are happening in the world now are so frightening that the only way you can venture to get relief from them is to have a bit of a light heart about it. So this is a lark on the day, and the Killarney was absolutely stunningly beautiful on the day. If you watch the video, you'll see how wonderful Kerry looks. Kerry is my native county, so it was a bit of a tourism promotion as well. I think.
If I can just jump in there, I absolutely concur. The po-faced self-importance of the would-be globalising, centralising adversary absolutely needs to have its bubble burst with ridicule. So I completely concur with you. But can I just ask you what it is? Yes. I like to hear from many voices if possible. What is it that particularly troubles you about what has been and may yet still be in the WHO's pandemic treaty and its associated international health regulations? What particularly troubles you?
What particularly troubles me is the complete loss of sovereignty of individual states to control their own health policy. That's the main thing, but so much else stems from that. We saw the dishonesty during the COVID scamdemic, which I think people are increasingly beginning to realize is what it was. We saw the deceitfulness. We saw the lies, frankly, of the WHO and how a lot of their information was used to manipulate people. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the head of the WHO, has a person with a dreadful background, a dreadful history. He's a Marxist to his fingertips. He has, apparently some rather strange habits, which we won't go into. Not the kind of a guy you want to be deciding your health policy, and to abrogate to these people, or for them to abrogate the power to instruct sovereign governments, democratically elected sovereign governments, to enact draconian measures against their own people on the basis of their declaring a health emergency without proper foundation, without proper assessment by the individual states. It really is the final step in the creation of an unaccountable one world government. The elites who were attempting increasingly to govern us, they seem to have no concept that lesser beings, the people who vote in elections, have any right to determine how their own lives should be led. And this is a classic example of it. Unfortunately, we have an Irishman in a very senior position in the WHO as well, Mike Ryan. It's very sad to see Irish people being involved in that kind of imposition of totalitarianism. Yeah, but the awful thing about the COVID situation was so many governments just went along with a narrative without properly assessing it. And the same thing can be said of the Irish court system. We have a court system here where everything must be tested against constitutionality. And people did take court actions against the activities of the government in terms of closing down hospitals, in closing down churches, in locking people up in their houses. And they had significant evidence from reputable experts that this was not necessary and would be counterproductive, which is exactly what it was.
bear with me, Michael Leahy. Ingrid Tarrant, compared to where we were a year ago, where no one seemed to know what the problem was with what was being proposed by the World Health Organization's proposed amendments, it does finally feel as if the world is aware of what the World Health Organization and Tedros Ghebreyesus are all about.
Yes.
It feels like we have raised the profile of all of it, and people know.
Yes, thank goodness. I mean, it's still not really talked about too widely in mainstream media. Luckily, we're talking about it here, and a lot of it is through the various other platforms, and it's absolutely brilliant. But I love, Michael, that you've just gone out there with your fishing rod and a loud hailer, because it's the humour that will spread across the world, and that is a wonderful way of getting that message across and what it really represents. And then people will look into it more and discover more.
I agree with what Ingrid's saying, because what they're proposing is ridiculous. Ridiculous is the word. That, no
It's
taxation without representation.
It's ridiculous, but it's frightening at the same time. And let's concentrate for the moment on ridiculing what is ridiculous and deserves to be ridiculed. I have to congratulate you people for the fact that you've highlighted this, because they have pulled back. And it's because we're speaking about it that they have pulled back. Because when the extraordinary thing in Ireland, this was passed almost without debate. This is the greatest loss of sovereignty since we joined the European Union, and it was passed actually far greater in many respects than when we joined the European Union. And it was passed almost without debate. That's the frightening thing about it, is that you will have elected parliamentarians who will basically toe the line handed down to them by international organisations. They seem to have adopted almost a cult status that you don't question these international bodies. That's very frightening for the continuance of parliamentary democracy if it's allowed to go ahead. But yeah, I think we've got to concentrate on the ridicule, because they are ridiculous, albeit that they're frightening, albeit that they're terrifying if they're ever enacted. Can you imagine handing over the power to a man like Ghebreyesus to declare a pandemic? And this guy is let's say he's a close friend of the Chinese Communist Party. They certainly backed him for the position. Can you imagine him being able to decide the minutiae of when you can leave your house, when you can go to church? Can you imagine ceding that kind of power? Because that's really what you are talking about. And these guys do not have our best interest at heart.
Michael, do you think has it been a long attritional process, do you think, whereby we have to take responsibility as well, that too many of us, and I hold my hand up and say that we've not been paying attention to these, and we've left the door open to those who, if we don't take responsibility for something as fundamental as how our health care is organised, that others, bad actors included, will do it for us? Do we have to finally realise that if we don't like what's being done, we have to stand up and take the responsibility and do it for ourselves?
Well, I think the key is don't trust authority. And the way these guys operate is they make everything seem incredibly complicated. So it's incredibly complicated how you fight a pandemic. You little people wouldn't know anything about this. Just listen to us, we're the experts. And that would be fine if they had any ethical sense, but they don't have any ethical sense. That sense has been lost from public life. It's a completely technocratic kind of an approach that they take to human life. That's never going to work. It's this overcomplication and over technicalization of matters that are very important to you and to I, about how your parents are going to be treated when they enter a hospital, or whether you get to see them in their last moments. Those are very simple, basic human requirements. But it has become overcomplicated, and that means that the presumption is there that an ordinary person can't make decisions about his own healthcare and about his own life, and that's wrong. And we've allowed ourselves to be bamboozled, I think, by that technocratization, I suppose, of very political matters. And these are political matters. Your healthcare is a political matter. It should be decided politically by elected representatives who can get the information and they have to be able to interrogate the experts that are presented to them. What we had in Ireland during the COVID lockdowns, we had a series of experts who effectively took over the government for 2 or 3 years, and the politicians were too afraid to ask them questions in case they sounded foolish. But that really is the central role of a politician today, is to be able to interrogate people when they present you with information that has a negative impact on society. And a lot of our politicians are afraid to do that.
Michael Leahy, thank you so much. It was a fascinating tale. So colourful. It had everything. It had comedy. It had landscape. and at its heart, the reminder of the fundamentally important point about holding at bay the globalists. Thank you, Michael Leahy. Another break, and then we will continue in the same vein, contemplating growing international popular opposition to potential global governance. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, the Sovereignty Coalition, with the help of senior US Senator Ron Johnson, demonstrated at an international meeting at Capitol Hill with members of Parliament to oppose potential global governance. At least 17 countries were represented. Ron Johnson joins me now. Good evening, sir.
Hello, Neil. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. It's lovely to see you. Earlier in the show, I was speaking to an Irish politician, Michael Leahy, who has been protesting against the World Health Organization, the pandemic treaty, and so on and so on. It does feel as though finally, after a very slow start, the peoples of the world are wakening up to the threat posed by increasingly centralised global governance. The news this week that the WHO has accepted that it no longer has a draft proposal for its members to sign. It feels as if we're moving in the right direction when it comes to challenging the centralising power.
Well, it was certainly good news that there was not an agreement voted on and approved during this round. But I just need to caution everybody that the globalists, they're relentless. For them, this is just a temporary setback. They'll be coming right back and doing everything they can to gain greater control over our lives, over our personal health autonomy. So I do appreciate the fact that more and more people's eyes are being opened. Thanks to people like you. I saw your interview with Dr. John Campbell. There's a growing group of people globally that recognize that our response to COVID was a miserable failure. It was run by a bunch of power-hungry politicians and other governmental officials that want control over our lives. But these people are relentless, and they're enormously powerful. They'll never admit they're wrong, and they've got the power to make it very difficult to prove them wrong. So again, we can't rest and be satisfied like this is the end of this. This is just the beginning.
There is, though, there was a great advantage of operating in the dark, so to speak. So much of it was happening out of sight of too many of us. I wonder if you agree or not that there seems to be an increasing towards a tipping point of people everywhere finally wakening up to the onerous responsibility almost to pay attention to what these organisations will do if they are not watched. But they are being watched now.
Again, there are more people with their eyes being opened, but I recently wrote a book for a forward to a book. And my main point was that there are basically three groups of individuals in the world today. There's the largest group, by far the largest, that just want to forget COVID. They just want to move on, whether they're either harmed or whether they cause harm. If they cause harm, they just want to be forgiven. Tough to make those decisions back then. And they just want to forget all this. Then there's a group, I would say you're in that group, I'm in that group. Our eyes were opened during COVID. And then, of course, the third group are the COVID cartel, the people that imposed all this on us. And again, they have the power. They've controlled the narrative. They call the truth misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So that's what we've got going on right now. The goal of the second group, those of us with our eyes opened, the good news is once our eyes are opened, you can't close them. And so you become dedicated to doing what we need to do, which is open up more people's eyes. So I agree with you. More people are aware, but we have a long way to go because so many people are just in this enormous state of denial. They deny vaccine injuries because they took the vaccine, that they don't want to think there's maybe a ticking time bomb in their body. The people that push the vaccines, they don't want to admit that maybe they pushed a vaccine that might have killed somebody or did them irreparable harm. So again, we've got an enormous challenge dealing with this global state of denial.
Ingrid Tarrant, I would say we can't move on, and we cannot forget what happened with COVID, and we cannot forgive unless and until, if at all, but unless and until we properly hear responsibility being taken for desperate mistakes.
But it never happens, Neil. It never happens. Nobody has really apologised for thalidomide. That's slightly not as serious. But look at the contaminated blood. COVID is the most recent. That's what everyone now will remember. The contaminated blood goes way back. Nobody has apologised. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And they are in a denial of their own. And we're not going to get it, but we will learn from this because we have lost trust, sadly, and we have lost faith. We've lost trust and faith in the organisations that we trusted and have always trusted, particularly the health organisations. We relied on them for polio injections, mumps and measles when we were growing up as children, and they were fine. But never again. And there'll be hesitancy with every single vaccine now that people are being offered.
Ron Johnson, that is a key issue that my guest in the studio, Ingrid Tarrant, raises, is it not? The complete breakdown of trust for so many people.
Well, absolutely. We actually do need, these health agencies to assess the safety of drugs and vaccines, to gather information and disseminate it honestly and transparently. But that's not what we have in the U.S. I would say that's not true in many ministries and agencies around the world. But again, the body count is way too high. On Vayer system alone, there's over 37,000 deaths reported globally associated with the COVID vaccine. 24% of those deaths occurred on the day of vaccination or within 1 or 2 days. Now we know that the Vayer system doesn't prove causation. That's correlation that ought to be looked into. We also know that Vayers dramatically understates the number of adverse events. So you've got the people that push this on everybody. The body count's way too high. You're starting to see in the American intelligence community, they call this a limited hangout. So you have the New York Times with an article saying there are people that are claiming vaccine injuries. Is anybody listening? You have Dr. Birx, who was one of the masterminds of this miserably failed response to COVID, now admitting that there were thousands injured by the vaccine. No, Dr. Birx, there were millions harmed by the vaccine. And again, it's that reality that people have been harmed. They know somebody's been harmed. I think 25%, according to a Rasmussen poll, believe that in the United States, 25% believe they know somebody who was killed by the COVID vaccine. So that's a reality that can't be denied, as much as they will deny it and as much as they completely try and sweep it under the rug. So that's our challenge. These people have power. They're not going to admit they're wrong. They've got the power to continue to sweep these things under the rug. But again, more people are opening up their eyes, and they actually know people who've been harmed. And so they're not trusting these agencies. And from my standpoint, we need agencies that can be trusted, but it's a good thing that these agencies aren't being trusted because they're not trustworthy.
I'm greatly encouraged, I have to say, that so many people are now able to use the kind of language that you're using. I can remember not so very long ago when to utter a sentence like that millions of people have been harmed by these products that were pushed as vaccines was absolutely unsayable. That was heresy. But it's now become the case that people like you and people like me and Ingrid, we can say these things, we can acknowledge these truths. And the number of people that are now listening to what is being said and beginning to come to terms with the scale of what has happened has to be encouraging, no?
You may be a little bit more of an optimist than I am, because I've been saying these things since literally March, April of 2020. I've been censored. I've been vilified. And I'm not taking this personally. I'm just saying I understand how difficult our task is. The entrenched interest. Again, the people who are responsible for these injuries, for these deaths, they have all the power. In the U.S., I call them the COVID cartel. The Biden administration, the federal health agencies who've been completely captured by big pharma, who've also captured the mainstream media and social media. Again, that's a powerful group of people right there, responsible for sabotaging early treatment, responsible for pushing protocols in hospitals that killed people, responsible for the vaccine. So again, we're up against those folks. That's why about their only line of defense is limited hangout, admitting to a few injuries, and then basically saying, listen, it was tough back then, hard to make these decisions. Please forgive us, but trust us moving forward. We're not going to make the same mistake again. Well, but they are going to make the same mistake. That's why they keep talking about disease X and bird flu and monkeypox and some universal vaccine. I mean, again, these folks are relentless. They're not giving up.
Ron, my guest in studio, Ingrid, has a question I think she would like to put to you, or a comment indeed.
Would you agree that one of probably the main reason why they're not admitting to fault and they're not giving the correct figures is because ultimately, if they admit to any mistakes, they have to pay for them? It's the compensation, because they're going for compensation. Very few people are getting compensated properly because they have to be a certain degree of vaccine injury. Is that at the basis of it all? It's like follow the money, but the money is stopping them from admitting any fault whatsoever.
I mean, that might be part of the reason, but again, I think it's just more personal accountability. Again, if the full facts were out, if all the gory detail of all the harms, all the deaths, I mean, again, the words that a lot of people in medical freedom movement use are crimes against humanity. I mean, if those crimes against humanity could be proven, there's going to have to be accountability. So I think it's just far more personal accountability, people's personal reputation, but also just the actual penalties to the people that cause these great harms. Again, if you had a loved one, and I've held forums of vaccine injured, father who lost his only child, those are people who are going to want retribution. They're going to want justice, and I think that's the main motivator here is people do not want to be held accountable. They don't want to have to face the justice that they should be faced with.
Ron Johnson, you just used and uttered another line that I think is so important to finally hear out there. Crimes against humanity. I think the more people that make that allegation, and we can at least hope that at some point it becomes listened to, that what we have witnessed here is a crime against humanity. Ron Johnson, thank you so much. Keep fighting, and I'll be alongside you. Thank you. Yet another break, after which we'll be joined by one of the 12 candidates vying to become Iceland's new president this weekend. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. This weekend, Icelanders head to the polls to elect their new president, their next president. There are 12 candidates, and we're joined by one now, Arnar Thor Johnson. Great to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here.
I look on at Iceland at the moment, and it seems to be a country that has gone a long way down the road to a lot of the things I fear. The digital IDs, basically the technocracy seems to have thoroughly got a hold of Iceland. What say you, Arnar?
Yeah, well, I say that I see this as a last gasp attempt really to repair our democracy. It is in serious decay as I see it. And you would think, talking about Iceland, that the image of freedom would be a sailor on his own boat in the Icelandic waters, but they are now being supervised by drones. So I'm running as a president saying that I want to supervise the politicians, but they're not too happy with that. They want to supervise us every day and everywhere we are, but they do not want a president who supervises them.
What will you do if you are voted into that office? What will be your set of priorities?
I would, of course, give a voice to the common man in Iceland. I would like to engage with the politicians on who they are working for. It seems to me they are working for international corporations and banks and foreign entities rather than the public of Iceland. And I would have the opportunity to force, in serious matters, a direct vote on the most important legislation, so that the common man could vote on our future here, which seems to be now decided somewhere else than in the Icelandic parliament.
What was your life before venturing into politics? And by extension, what was it that bumped you out of your life of before to take this step of seeking to be the president?
Yeah, I was an associate law professor in Reykjavik, and I was a district court judge, and I just wanted to participate in democratic debate. We have a proud Republican tradition here in Iceland. We formed a parliament in the year 930, where we decided we were going to live here by the law and not by the sword. And it seems to me that that was based on the fact that the law grew out of society. It did not come from above like a ton of bricks. But that has been our experience in the past 10 years or so. And the weight of those bricks seem to be ever increasing. And the voice of the common man is to be heard less and less. So that power is moving away, further away from the people, further away even from the parliament. And even the parliamentarians themselves seem to be herded like sheep. So I want to participate in democratic debate, and I want to reclaim this proud Republican tradition that we have in Iceland.
Arnar, do you see yourself as a lone voice standing against this World Economic Forum centralising forces that are out there? Or amongst your fellow candidates, is anyone else making the same appeal?
Not really, but we do have three candidates. Since you asked, we have three candidates running for the presidency now that have ties to the World Economic Forum, and I think the general public is not aware of anything that goes on within that framework. But I think the dam could be about to break, because people sense that something is seriously wrong with our the way the country is run. I mean, we have high taxes, the health system is crumbling, the education system is crumbling, the road system is crumbling within under its own weight. So something has to change, and that might happen before tomorrow when the vote is cast.
There seems a recurrent theme, as far as I'm concerned, that over the last few years it's been either countries with small populations seem to have been routinely treated as some kind of lab rats, petri dishes for whatever the globalists have in mind. You know, we saw it in New Zealand, we saw it relatively small population in Australia, relatively small population in Canada. These smaller populations, relative to their landscapes, are really taking the hit. Do you agree, and do you understand why those populations have been and are being targeted in that way?
Yeah, we are sensitive. I mean, we are a tiny nation of less than 400,000 people. And with the mass immigration and everything that's going on, and with the power grab that has happened, we will be facing an existential threat, I would say, in the next few years. I think it looks as though we will become a minority within our own country in 20 or 30 years. I don't know what will happen to our language when that happens. So what will happen with our law, what will happen with our democracy. The party, I don't know how the situation is in the UK, but here the parties are somewhat, they have merged, it seems. So one of the candidates running now is a former PM who quit as a PM to run for president. He's a left-green politician now being supported by the powers that be within the Conservative Party. So people don't know anymore what is left or right, what is up and down, and are really confused about what's going on, because politics have somehow disappeared. And we have to regain that. We have to regain somehow the liberal tradition of being able to debate and have a real discussion, rather than using these offensive words that are being thrown about if someone is tends to be on the conservative or classical liberal side.
Let me reassure you, Arnar, here in the UK, we have learned to say that the political parties that were once left and right are simply two cheeks of the same arse. My guest in the studio, Ingrid Tarrant, it is fascinating, isn't it? The way here we're listening to Iceland, or someone speaking from Iceland, and what's being said, the complaint being made, the protests that are being sounded, is so familiar. We hear it again and again and again.
Well, Arna's talking about England. I mean, it's almost down to the potholes in the roads. The roads are healthy, everything. It just shows, though, there's this creep all over the world. And I would have thought that Iceland would have been a little bit protected because it's an island, it's so far away, immigration is a problem. I didn't expect to hear that. And sooner or later, on sorry.
Go ahead, Arnar.
We have prided ourselves in not having an army here, but now what has happened is they are spending our money, which they could easily have spent on the roads and the health system. They're spending it on buying bombs to use in foreign countries. And it's something that they didn't even present to us, the general public, before they decided it. So,
exactly the same here, Arno. Really, I sympathise, and I'm so surprised to hear that you're experiencing the same problem, especially with the immigration in that way, and that you think that, like we do, that in a few generations your language will be gone and be taken over by something else.
Yeah. What would be your message to us? I mean, what could you say to us and the normal Icelandic voter now?
Come to England for a week and you'll see how it is here, and vote for you, because Arna, you have got it absolutely right.
Arna, I would say it's important for a population like yours, and not exclusively, that you're not alone. There are so many of us as individuals during the last few years. Those of us who are like-minded found each other and came together and linked arms, so to speak. And when we hear your testimony from Iceland, a place from which we do not hear enough, you'll be reassured that the concerns that you're voicing are concerns that more and more people here and elsewhere are voicing. We are all speaking increasingly with one voice, just demanding to be heard.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Luckily, you're a small enough country to be able to do it. You are the size of a big village, so you would be like our local council. So you do have a real opportunity, fortunately, to be able to make a big difference to your country.
Arna, it's been great to hear from you. It's been great to be brought up to date with a place, as I say, that we don't hear enough from. All the best of luck with what lies immediately ahead. We'll catch up with you soon. Thank you, Arna.
Thanks you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GBNews. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Neil. It was wonderful being here.
Thank you for sharing that time with me. And all being equal, all being well, we shall be together again in the same place next week.